So hello everybody and welcome to this wonderful course on horror at the University of the Underground. I'm Agi Haines. I'm the head of the horror programme, which is a critical exploration into illicit societal fears and human passion for horror. We're going to be investigating institutions and popular culture through the lens of the horror genre in dramaturgy, film, costume making and more. The University of the Underground is a free, pluralistic and transnational university founded in 2017 and birthed in the basements of nightlife venues in Amsterdam and London. We're a non-profit and registered charity, so if you'd like to donate, please visit universityoftheunderground.org. On this website, you can also find other exciting program times and events. Also check out their Instagram page for amazing videos. And I'm hoping that this will be one of them. I'm going to be sharing with you some of my work. So let me share my screen with you now. Okay, oh great, I can still see you all. So wonderful, I'm Agi Haines. As I mentioned, I'm an artist, designer, lecturer and researcher. I'm extremely excited to be talking about horror. Predominantly today, I'm going to be going through some of my practice, and I'm hoping that I'll touch on elements of how this relates to horror. But ultimately, I've really grown up with horror. These are my parents. They met because they both worked at Madame Tussauds. This is them working there in London. My dad, his face is actually the face of Vlad the Impaler in the London dungeons. And as you all probably know, Vlad the Impaler was the influence for Dracula. He was a very famous torturer, so that's my dad's face. He also has gone on to do a lot of prop making, which has greatly influenced my work. So this is for, I'm sure a lot of you are probably horror film buffs, but this is for Event Horizon. He's also worked on a lot of other interesting projects with various people, for example, Zombie Boy more recently on the topics of horror. My mum, on the other hand, I'm just giving you a little, my history. My mum used to do some really interesting set design for Madame Tussauds, particularly of famous murderers' houses. So this was a set that she designed for John Christie, who famously killed a lot of people, and wallpapered over them in his kitchen. But what was really amazing was she managed to source things like the gas pump that actually was in his house and various other things that she utilized. So what's really been interesting for me growing up is that we've had a lot of strange objects around our house in connection to horror. So I feel like it's a topic that's very close to my heart. So in terms of my practice, my design practice, I make a lot of work about how we understand, represent and shape the body in the face of new technologies, so particularly biological and healthcare technologies, and how designers can play a very significant part in things like theorizing the impacts of technology on the body and society in general. So I believe that design is somewhat responsible for shaping mental models of the body. So historically, the way that we've understood the body is to make images of it. So researchers from loads of different disciplines would all get together to create these atlases of the body through dissecting corpses, essentially, where they delineate parts of the body and make drawings of those parts. But the way that those parts have been cut up and drawn has essentially really impacted the way that we've understood the body for years. So Garland, who's a very famous European anatomist who was sort of the authority on how we understood the body for quite some time, was very concerned, because he was a very religious person, about the ethical issues of dissecting bodies. So what they used to do was dissect animals and then utilize things like pigs and goats and rats to understand human bodies. But that came with it a lot of other issues of, obviously we're not necessarily exactly the same as those creatures. So this sort of led to a domino effect of other sort of concerns. But since then, Vesalius wrote this amazing book, De Humani Corpus Fabrica, which is awesome. And the reason why is because essentially I think what Vesalius is doing is very much what Nelly's been trying to do on this course. He'd get, as you can see in this picture, people from totally different disciplines to take the body apart and try and understand it. And that went into this big book, De Humani Corpus Fabrica, which was really sort of become the ultimate atlas of the body that people still refer to today. He was sort of I think almost like the father of modern anatomy. So students for a long time since Vesalius was around would cut open body parts, and things like corpse work, cadaverous research became very popular. But the ethics behind cadaverous research has still been like very problematic. So throughout time, people would dissect people that they assumed were lower members of society, which of course is like extremely disturbing. And this is like still remnants of that still remain in medical research today. But what was really interesting around this time when cadaverous research was going on was that students would pose for photos, imagining that they were the ones on the dissection table where their dissected specimens may eventually sort of come back to life and wreak some sort of revenge on the fact that they've been cutting them apart for research. But now the collection of bodies for an anatomical research has really significantly changed. So as part of this collaboration, this is Marcel de Jeune, Jos van de Geest, from a collaboration I did as part of the BioArt and Design Awards. While we were exchanging details on a phone call a while ago, this is some of the sort of weird and wonderful stuff that can happen when you meet different people, you engage with different people throughout your collaborations. Dr. Zhu lifted up this clean white bucket whilst we were on Zoom, and he held it up towards the webcam and just took out a plastinated face specimen, which is like one of the weirdest things that has ever happened to me. But about a month later, I had the opportunity to go and meet them in the cadaverous research lab and touch this amazing face specimen, and they were doing some really amazing research there. But to Erasmus now is a place that really virtuously takes care of its human specimens, in the lab, in the laboratory, in a really respectful fashion. It's not necessarily how it used to be, but there are still sort of remaining issues. But accessing things like human materials, it hasn't always been really morally sound, and in some cases is very questionable indeed. And so I like to think that my work, and particularly what I'll be talking to you a lot about on this course, I suppose, is that I think my work is almost like one of these student nightmare images of current techniques and technologies as we sort of push forwards, always trying to know more about the body, but often at what cost. So again, like the way that people have accessed this material over time, dead material, has a sort of long and complicated past. I don't know if anyone's seen these people before, but this are two very famous producers of body material for medical research. This is Burke and Hare. They had very devious ways to fill the quota of cadavers needed for scientific research. So they provided bodies for dissection, and they ended up doing various things like grave robbing and eventually killing people in order to generate enough material that people could utilize for scientific research. But what was really interesting is after they committed a lot of these crimes, Burke's body was made into a series of pocketbooks that were sort of collectible. This is actually weirdly something that happens quite often. It's not that unusual. It's called bibliopegy, where people make books out of human skin. And also the blood from his head was used to write a series of embarrassing and shaming letters to sort of prove that what they'd been doing was wrong, regardless of the fact that the research that came out of it was incredibly important. So now there's still a massively high demand for this kind of material, but it's just developing through very different technologies. So for example, research into regenerative species, stem cell regrowth, the regrowth of human cells in other animals, for example. But our bodies are capable of regrowth and regeneration. And if you look at things like these amazing old rhinoplasty techniques, skin and flesh could be borrowed from elsewhere to create things, or even other areas of the body. So Harold Gillies, for example, was this amazing surgeon where he would do these surgical procedures that he came up with, predominantly on soldiers who'd suffered horrible blast wounds. And what was really amazing was he'd sculpt new faces out of their own body by cutting what's known as a pedicle, where you cut an area of flesh, fold it over, allow the bit underneath to heal, and then essentially you can cut that tube off and stick it somewhere else, as almost like modeling clay, like you're sort of generating new structures for people's faces. So with access to these sort of amazing bodily materials and generation of body materials, the body is sort of really shifted from being a subject of design to being a subject for design. And I think there's a lot of people here whose work actually probably touches on a lot of these topics. So the body is really a biotechnological product now that is sort of becoming modifiable and commercializable. But, you know, I'm interested in what the domino effects of that might be and how that might affect how people decide which scientific research is worthy of time and effort. So quite some time ago now, I spent a while looking at how I might modify myself utilizing some of these historical surgical procedures, and what I might use some of these techniques for. So I spent a while looking at bone. Bone is a really fascinating material that can, living bone can maneuver up to 1 millimeter a day. I don't know if any of you have had teeth braces and things like that. You can really shift your teeth around using frames, for example, Ilsarov frames. And I sort of tried to think about how I might modify myself. These are some very, probably like the first prosthetics I ever made quite some time ago now, where I was trying to imagine how I might make myself more aerodynamic. So how I might move my bone essentially to become better at sport. But what was really interesting about doing a deep dive into this research, and this is really sort of the basis of my PhD that has sort of been ongoing research for quite some time, was that this seems to be something that people do to their children. So people, particularly parents, especially mothers, have modified their children for quite a number of years, most probably to make sure that they fit more comfortably within the bounds of social norms. So, for example, it was once thought to be beneficial to have a pointed shaped head, particularly in the UK. It's thought now to be beneficial to have a round shaped head. So these sort of devices that might modify us are still ongoing and actually available at places like the NHS. So this went on to become the basis for a project that looked at whether parents might modify their children to benefit them later in life. So I designed a series of babies, all based on various modifications that might ultimately help them later on. So some of them are for environmental reasons, for example, extending your head surface area because of global warming. Would you be able to live more comfortably? Removing a toe to prevent asthma, having, you know, is it to do with socioeconomic status? Would it be beneficial to have larger cheeks, you can earn more money, or have like new orifices, so that if you suffer from like a long-term condition like diabetes, it could be quite helpful. So really, I was really interested in like the sort of fear and hype that's presented alongside technologies such as genetic engineering, the idea of designer babies. Although we've had these surgical procedures for years that might allow us to alter our children already with what we already have. So all of these were based on surgical procedures that could happen immediately right now. So the thing that I found quite interesting about doing this project is like the representation of scientific discovery can produce this like amazing further funding and interest, but it's really important to build a sensibility to how medical procedures and the people involved are presented, particularly when the subject of a procedure might be too young or vulnerable to make a decision about whether it's right for them to go through something so drastic, which is why I think it's really important to try and visualize the future of research And of course, I don't necessarily believe that we should be violently modifying vulnerable members of society. That's obviously not the point of the work. But the modified babies, for example, seem extremely frivolous, particularly in light of those in need of healthcare, accessibility to food and wealth, that might deny them to access to these decisions that might lead to procedures such as these, that might only be available to a small subset of society. So again, I'm really interested in the moral decision making that goes into research, and ultimately the people that I collaborate with, that's often the thing we end up talking about. I'm currently doing a residency with the Systems Modelling and Quantitative Biomedicine Department at the University of Birmingham, and we're looking at like the larger questions associated with their work, and ultimately that's sort of what's happened throughout my career. I've sort of looked at a particular topic or an element of research. For example, in this case, I was looking at bioprinting, and trying to work out whether, is it worthwhile financially? What will come out of this sort of research? How will it enter the body, and how will it affect people? So bioprinting is something I'm sure you're all aware of now. It's sort of been going around for quite some time. The research has been, funding into the research has been going up and down as people change their understanding of the worth of the research. But essentially you lay down cells to form complex 3D structures. So again, this is seems like a million years ago now, but this was a project where I was looking at how you might bioprint different cells in various different orders in order to create complex 3D forms that it might take evolution millions of years to create otherwise. So this was a defibrillating organ. So if you suffered from a heart attack, you could have this fitted. This was an organ to prevent you having a stroke. And this was for someone who might suffer from something like cystic fibrosis. So it's a way of dislodging mucus out through the digestive system. So moving on to something a little bit different, not all of these technologies are necessarily biological, even though a lot of the things that I make are how technologies might make us feel feel things, feel abject, feel concerned about the future, feel things like cosmic dread or cosmic horror. And this is a really interesting piece of video. I'm sure you're all aware of Boston Dynamics. They're a company that actually started, for those of you horror film buffs, they started because they were making props for films, and then they've ended up going on to making this amazing robotics company. But what I found really interesting is the way that they treat the robots is quite disturbing. So you see people kicking the robots and stuff. So a while ago I went to did this project for a conference where people would attend the conference and scream at this face. And it's sort of meant to be an empathy tool to train people to engage with robotic forms slightly differently. So if you shout at it, it will frown. If you shout really, really loud, it will cry. And if you really, really scream, it will suffer a nose hemorrhage. But that's quite challenging to do. So this is quite an interesting project for me to sort of try and understand how people might engage with not necessarily just biological forms, but how you can empathize between yourself and non-biological forms as well. Here again is me with Joss, who you saw a photo with earlier. Similarly, the research that went into making the face was actually helped me get some funding to do another project. So using that prototype of the face, I made a proposal to something called the BioArt and Design Awards. If that's something that interests you, it's an awesome funding for young designers who are interested in bioarts. It's in the Netherlands. I think the format might be changing quite a lot, but it's based at MOO in Eindhoven, which is a fantastic gallery. We did a project where we took a scan of my brain, and we wanted to try and code it into a drone. So I wanted to see if I could feel a connection or feel more empathy towards a physical object. So we took this scan of my brain. I worked with some computational neuroscientists in order to create what's known as like a neural network, which was based on my brain data. So what we could do is we could drop information into the neural network, and then that would send information to this flying machine and tell it how to maneuver around a space. And I thought, oh wow, it would be really amazing. I could see this drone flying around, and maybe I might feel some sort of connection to it, as though it's sort of my consciousness flying around the gallery space. But we had a lot of issues with it. Unfortunately, it popped, which was very upsetting. But it was quite interesting, again, particularly for me, to see if I could create a sensation in myself that somehow connected to this physical object. And it did move very slowly, but it was functioning on the basis of the artificial neural network. So it was really strange as well, and a bit of an uncanny feeling for me to experience like this object that was acting specifically on an image of my brain, or how the structure of my brain, how the information moves throughout the structure of my brain. And for a lot of you, like some of these, like the visuals sort of bear resemblance to horror films that you've probably all been aware of. This was quite a famous film about a floating brain. So I yeah, took a lot of influence from things like this. So I whilst I was in the Netherlands, I think there actually might be a few of you who are based in the Netherlands too, but I did a residency at the Varg Society. Again, they're a really interesting research institution, and they are a fabulous resource, particularly for the topic of horror. The building is one of the oldest buildings in Amsterdam, and it was an anatomical and a masonry school. But now there's a really interesting event space in there where they run workshops. There are a lot of really interesting workshops online currently, and they have a hackerspace and a wet lab in there. So it's really interesting that this place that was once used for medical innovation is sort of still being used for that kind of research. So yeah, historically, like 400 years ago, what would happen is people would be hung outside. So criminals would be hung outside, and their bodies would be taken through the walls of this anatomical and masonry school. And it's still exactly the same inside as it was hundreds of years ago. It's totally amazing. So there's right at the pinnacle of the dome, at the top of the Varg, is Frederick Reich's surgical crest. So Frederick Reich was this amazing surgeon. He's also known as the artist of death. People weren't sure about whether his work was art or science, which I always think is really fascinating. And again, he would raise ethical questions through making really horrific vanitas, which he would put together all of these wonderful body parts, particularly from fetal specimens, lungs, bits of nervous system that had been wax had been pushed through. And what was really interesting was he'd accumulate them and create like narratives around them. So he wasn't just utilizing them for scientific inquiries, but also utilizing them for artistic inquiries. And he opened up a really amazing museum of this work. Here's him testing some of his embalming techniques on a fetus. And some of them were so precise, he came up with all these amazing ways, alternative ways of embalming. So this is a head of a child, but what he would do was add things like fabrics in order to, you know, hide where lacerations were, and it made the specimen seem much more living, as though, you know, they're actually, you know, coming to life almost. So I'm sort of going to move a little bit quicker now because I know we're running out of time, but there's an amazing history of the representation of anatomical paintings. So again, people would want to get involved in this kind of research and pay to make it seem as though they were involved in this kind of research. So I think the institution of medicine is a really fascinating one. The way that people engage with the body, and whether they're not engaging but they might pay to look as though they are engaging with the body, is sort of quite a fascinating thing. So at the Varg we decided to run something called the anatomy lesson, Dissecting Medical Futures. And this was a really interesting collaborative project for me, where often the type of work I do is highly criticized for going into a gallery and then not going anywhere afterwards. So that's something that I really want to try and avoid, the fact that I might put down a piece of sculptural work, people come and see it, but ultimately what happens next, it might change the way you think, but ultimately how can I carry on that engagement? So I worked with a series of different researchers. This is Mona Nasser. She's an evidence-based dental clinician. She's also one of the supervisors on my PhD. And she was one of the advisors on this project, along with other researchers from the Free University Amsterdam who are looking at things like epigenetics. So we made a series of objects that audience members could come in and dissect, which was super fun, but very upsetting for those of you who know how long it takes to make some of this stuff. You know, we were making eyeballs that, like, when you cut into, they would leak fluids and things, which obviously took quite a long time because I'd have to generate them in layers. And then, you know, an audience member would just come in and cut one up, and I'd sort of, a bit of my heart would break. But it was really fantastic, because really ultimately what I got out of doing this project was these amazing conversations with audience members who suddenly felt like they could share things with me that I probably wasn't really expecting them to share with me. So I had so many people dissecting an eye and then going, oh, my uncle had this weird problem with their eye, and I was like, whoa, should I know this information? But ultimately what it meant was that, like, the project's still ongoing, and the network that's come out of this project has been extremely helpful for my own research. This is an example of one of the pieces. So I worked with someone at the Free University who was looking at a particular type of paint that is, so it's super fine paint. When you grind it down, people in the factory are having issues because they're breathing this paint in and it's sticking to their lungs and causing all these issues. So we sort of came up with this idea, wouldn't it be really great if you could have like a nanoparticle filter that could capture these particles that go into your lungs? This was a project in collaboration with Dr. Vaibhav Tyagi, who he's a brain imaging specialist and neuroscientist. And we were looking at, there's a company called Clarity that's making mice see-through, which is really fascinating. At the moment, they can only do it with dead material, but the idea is that ultimately it might be able to work on living material. But there always seems to be a cost to this kind of research. So regardless of the fact that we might eventually be able to make part of the body see-through, which could make things like surgical procedures less invasive, that it's not necessarily something that could be reversed. So you might just have a bit of a see-through body part for the rest of your life if this is something that you ended up doing, which is sort of like showing, I suppose, that the future is complicated. It's not necessarily black and white. And I think we'll be looking at that a lot on this course on horror, in that, like, that it's not necessary, things aren't necessarily just good and bad. There's lots of complexities between those two polemics. So finally, I'm going to move on right to the end. Wait, let me go. I'm not going to talk about Kentucky Fried Chicken, but so what we're going to be having a little think about is splitting horror up into various parts. So for me, I don't know whether you've noticed, but during my presentation, there are different things that lead into sensations of horror that's very helpful for me to get messages across to people. So one thing that I think is really important to mention is that we're going to be separating what's known as natural horror from art horror. So natural horror is what Noel Carroll describes horror that's experienced in life. For example, the horrors of war or horrors at someone's action. Art horror, on the other hand, is emotions that horror narratives and images are designed to elicit from audiences. So art horror names the emotion that creators of the genre have perennially sought to instill in their audiences, whereas natural horror is something that happens in every day. And I think what really ultimately what we're going to be trying to do is explore different forms of art horror, so different mediums to create narratives around horror as a means to deal with natural horror or horror that happens on a daily basis. So Vivian Sobchak writes particularly about horror in films, and she says that horrors provoke in us carnal thoughts that ground and inform more conscious analysis. So meaning can be created through the body or through bodily sense. And someone called Donald Kupchik talks about this, that we'll be looking at this in more detail throughout the course, but Kupchik talks about top-down and bottom-up horror. So the insights described above in my presentation show that things like, tragic irony, pathogen disgust, things like those kinds of emotions might be described as like top down, where feelings are the shadow of cognition. So you think about something, and then the more you think about it, you feel disgusted, or you feel, oh, that's terrible. Whereas bottom up is more like you get a visceral sensation. You're suddenly like, and then afterwards that makes you think. So, you might get a feeling of like, oh, that makes me feel sick. Oh, I'm really scared. And then like, oh, later on you might lie in bed at night and that might haunt you. And film has done this really well. So we're going to be splitting horror into these different elements. We're going to be looking at thrill, dread, monster horror. We're going to be looking at paranormal, psychological horror, killer, gore, cosmic horror, so things like H.P. Lovecraft, etc. But in the next few weeks, we're going to be specifically looking at objection, which is the feeling of otherness. And ultimately, I kind of feel like with my practice, that's the sensation that I'm trying to capture in myself and in my audiences. And I think is a really great place to start. So we're going to be having a look at different bodily prototyping techniques to explore sensations of objection. So I'm hoping we can all make each other feel a little bit abject in the coming weeks. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for listening, everybody.
Don't stop just yet. Maybe just if anyone has got any question for Agi, we might as well just include that in there. And if you feel shy, you can also drop them inside the chat section.
I have a question, actually.
Yeah,
what was the name again of that research institution in Amsterdam that you were about?
it's I'll write it in the,
yeah,
it's called the Varg Society.
Ah.
Yeah, it's really awesome. They're doing some really interesting online sort of workshops at the moment, because they for example, I went to one a while ago by Spela Petrick. She runs quite a few there, which are really great on things like growing or extracting your own hormones and things like that, which is really fascinating. But they're sort of trying to find alternative ways to do that online at the moment. So check out their website.
Yeah, I will have a look. I used to live around the corner from that building last year.
Oh,
I didn't
really?
realize it had so much. Yeah, like I didn't realize it was a research center.
Oh, it's awesome. If you end up going there again, like there's a door, you just like there's a restaurant underneath, but around the side is a door. If you just knock on it, they'll let you in and show you around. Everyone there's lovely. So it's definitely worth doing.
I'll go and have a look. Thank you.